Well, welcome to the call tonight. My name is Liz Butler, and I'm the Organizing Director for Friends of the Earth. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we dive in, I wanted to extend our thoughts to those affected by the hurricanes in Irma and Harvey. We're hoping everyone affected stays safe and speedy recovery from the storms. Tonight, we're going to talk about a critical issue facing our environment today, protecting the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Right now, as most of you have seen, the Trump administration, the House Republicans and Senate Republicans are proposing devastating 31% cut to the agency. But for many of us, I think people have struggled with, well, what does this mean? What will exactly happen to the EPA if they were to get their way? Tonight, we're going to actually hear from 3 former EPA staff about how the budget cuts affect the agency's day-to-day operations and really affect their ability to enact environmental protections. After they speak, we'll have some time for questions and potentially some of them from all of you on the phone tonight. After the question and answer, our organizers are going to walk you through exactly what you can do over the next month and a half as this battle continues in Congress. To start off and talk about the budget process so far and to introduce our amazing guest speakers, I'm going to pass things over to Lucas. Lucas, are you there?
Thanks, Liz. Hello, everyone. Like Liz said, my name's Lucas, and I'm the Climate and Energy Campaigner for Friends of the Earth based here in Washington, D.C. Before I introduce tonight's guests, which is what we're all really here for, I wanted to give a quick update on where we are in the budget process. As many of you know, September was supposed to be a little bit of a ticking budget bomb. Government funding was set to expire at the end of the month, followed soon after by a potential breach of the debt ceiling. In theory, these are supposed to be separate issues, but we were preparing for them to be used kind of in tandem as leverage to push a very dangerous agenda, including possibly the defunding of Planned Parenthood, the funding of Trump's border wall, or deep cuts to our core programs, including within the EPA. But last week we heard that there was a deal struck between Trump and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. But a lot of the coverage about what happened has been pretty confused, and we don't actually have that much to celebrate. So keep that in mind as you're scanning the newspapers. The debt ceiling has been extended through December 8th, and we have a continuing resolution through December 8th as well. In English, what that means is we have a temporary freeze of current spending levels for the government. It basically just keeps everything on ice going as it was until December 8th. That doesn't come close to the long-term certainty that the EPA and a lot of other agencies need to continue their important work protecting our environment. And it doesn't really address the fact that what we've known for a long time and what we're going to be hearing about more in a couple minutes is that the EPA actually needs much more funding to do its essential functions, to rein in polluters, and enforce laws that are already on the books. So keep in mind that we haven't so much stopped a disaster as we have postponed it. We're going to be in almost exactly the same situation 3 months from now as we were last week. So we basically have that long to organize and prepare and protect the EPA from being cut to the bone. And to talk more about the threat to EPA funding and what those cuts could actually mean if they were enacted, we're going to hear now from 3 former EPA staff. George Wyeth, Francis Schultz, and Gay McGregor. George is a lawyer who joined the EPA in 1989 in the General Counsel's office and who wore many hats in his years there, including most recently in the Office of Enforcement. Francis worked for 35 years in the Pacific Southwest Regional Office, headquartered in San Francisco, where she did everything from Superfund to hazardous waste management, many things in between. And Gay worked for over 2 decades at the EPA's National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Lab in Ann Arbor, where she says she did everything that didn't require an engineering degree, from from writing regulations, from being a division manager, and much else. So without further ado, we're going to be hearing from George first and then going in order. Thank you again for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Lucas. This is George, and as Lucas said, I spent my my career at EPA. It was 27 years, and I just left in January. I spent it all in Washington, D.C., so I'll talk a little bit about what goes on at headquarters. But before that, I want to provide a little bit of historical context and just what the big picture is on EPA's budget this year. Liz mentioned that the administration proposed a budget that would cut EPA's overall budget by 31%. The House of Representatives, the House Appropriations Committee recently adopted a budget that has smaller cuts, about 7% overall. But what I want to convey on this call is that a 7% cut overall, it means truly draconian cuts to EPA's operating programs. This is classic Trump bargaining. You just ask for an absurd amount to begin with, and then when you end up negotiating to what is just a very bad amount, somehow it looks like it's all okay. But in reality, a 7% cut in 1 year, I mean, you can imagine that for most organizations you're familiar with or with your own budget, a 7% cut in 1 year is a hard thing to swallow. But what's most important in this case is that EPA's budget has been declining consistently for over 10 years. And the budget right now for 2017, for the current year, is 23% lower than it was in 2004. So that was the middle of the George W. Bush administration, not an administration that was known for being particularly eco-friendly. And yet our current budget for right now, and before any cuts go into effect, is already 23% below that. We're 10% below where we were 5 years ago. The number of employees has dropped from 17,000 to just around 15,000, and the Pruitt administration is doing all that they can to do buyouts and reduce the number of employees further. So the current level of funding, 2017, for EPA is really a severely underfunded agency. And so to take an additional cuts to that really is going the wrong direction. We should be restoring the resources that EPA needs, not taking more away. And if you think about 2004 versus today, think about the programs that have grown. Most of the climate programs, at least until this year, grew, and they had to grow because it's become a larger and larger part of EPA's responsibilities. All of that, if the budget as a whole is declining, that means that all of that has to come out of other parts of the agency. So EPA has been hurting, especially those core programs. You also have to understand that when we talk about EPA's budget, there are really three parts to it, and only one part of it, which is a little over half, is the actual operating budget for EPA. About 13% of what we call EPA's budget actually flows through to states because EPA helps pay state agencies to run their clean air programs, their clean water programs, lead programs, and all of the others. And about 30% of it goes to local governments to pay for their wastewater treatment systems and pay for their drinking water systems, which are just incredibly expensive. So only about half of it goes to EPA's operations, and the state grants and the drinking water grants have been largely held harmless in this budget. So that means that while maybe a 7% cut overall for the budget, the EPA operating budget is being cut by, depending on the program, between 10 and 15%. So you take 10 to 15% on top of a historically declining budget, and you're talking about an agency that's being seriously depleted. So what does that mean in practice? And that's what Lucas alluded to. EPA, so I'm going to just talk about what happens at headquarters at EPA, which is a very wide, very diverse set of things. It's because it's the national headquarters, it's where rules are set and where policies are made. And those are both resource-intensive activities, and of course it cuts across all the different programs. So we're talking about the Clean Air Program, we're talking about Clean Water Program, controls on polluting facilities, but then also as the nature of the problems has changed, it's also gotten into watershed programs and programs addressing agricultural runoff. We have new requirements for reviewing chemicals under the new Toxic Substances Control Act Reform Bill. We have to review pesticides. It's interesting that the agricultural industry is actually concerned about cuts to the pesticide program because they want those products on the market. They need something that has been approved so that they can use the product. And EPA, EPA has to approve pesticides before they go on the market. Headquarters programs issue the policies. Often a rule will come out, but there are many other issues that arise under that require policies to be done, which allow, and the states being the ones that really implement it, depend on EPA to issue these policies to ensure consistency across the country. Headquarters also includes the enforcement program and the scientific research program. We couldn't issue our regulations if we didn't have science underlying it. So that research program is critically important. It includes other programs like the Environmental Justice Program, and if people know about NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, our reviews. For example, EPA weighed in on the Keystone Pipeline with our views on the environmental impacts of that. I'm probably leaving out half of what goes on at headquarters, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of all the things that are at stake if we cut those headquarters programs by 10 to 15%. Sitting here right now, we can't say exactly where the axe is going to fall, but it's going to fall in one of those areas that I described. So I think I'll stop there just so we can keep moving along, and I'll turn it over to Fran.
Thanks, George. Thanks also for that really good overview of what the current budget situation is. As George mentioned, there are a lot of really important functions that occur in the headquarters office. I'll talk about the regional offices because that's where I have my 35 years of experience, and that's where a lot of the agency's environmental programs are carried out. George mentioned a number of those programs. I won't go over that again, but let me start by saying that each of the 10 regions of EPA is responsible for from 4 to 8 states, the territories, and any tribal lands within their borders. The Pacific Southwest region, Region 9, where I worked, is responsible for California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, the territories of Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and 148 Native American tribes. And before I left the agency in 2015, I experienced the declining budgets that had happened over the prior years, and particularly the severe cuts that kicked in after sequestration took effect in about 2013. EPA employees are very motivated. They tend to be very mission-oriented, but all of these losses add up, and EPA's employees will have to accomplish less simply because there are going to be fewer of them, there already are fewer of them, and there are fewer resources to support them. I'll give some examples of what regional offices do. This can only be some examples given the time. And I'll give some examples of some of the geographically significant work in Region 9. Each region would have its own particular geographically or otherwise significant challenges. First, I'll mention compliance inspections and enforcement because it applies to all the programs and it is literally the backbone of the environmental programs and the environmental statutes. Civil and criminal investigations are largely carried out by the regions, but there are some enforcement actions taken by headquarters, particularly if they have a multi-state or national scope. So the most challenging ones are done by EPA headquarters, but there's a great deal of work that happens in the region on inspections and enforcement. A good enforcement program makes a level playing field nationally so that everyone, regardless of where they live, has the same protections. But without a good enforcement program, there's no incentive to comply with permits or regulations, and with fewer staff and resources, there will be less compliance. I'll talk about this Superfund program. In Region 9, there are over 150 Superfund sites in that region alone. And cuts to Superfund means that cleanups at the worst contaminated sites will slow down. Contamination like groundwater contamination will be allowed to spread. Cleanups will become more expensive in the long run. And the ability to carry out the agency's responsibilities related to giving the public the opportunity to be involved in selecting cleanup remedies will also be more difficult. The Clean Air Act has led to significant and quantifiable air quality improvements across the country and in Region 9, but there are still improvements needed everywhere. In Region 9 in particular, because of local geographic features and emissions generated by goods movement, California continues to be home to the two areas with the worst air quality in the country. And the administration's efforts to roll back Clean Air Act protections and cut funding put the population in those areas at even greater risk, including low-income communities of color who may be disproportionately impacted. George mentioned the NEPA program, and EPA has a role in reviewing the environmental impact statements of projects funded by or requiring permits from other federal agencies or departments. And when I left almost 2.5 years ago, Region 9 was already straining to handle the most reviews in the country simply because of the rapid growth and development in the Southwest. But even so, these reviews have resulted in real project improvements that lessen environmental impacts. There will be more impacts if funding is lost or if, as has also been proposed, Congress takes this role away from EPA. And incidentally, as an aside, I'll mention that the public has often used EPA's comments on EISs as a basis to sue project proponents when they're dissatisfied. I mentioned earlier geographically significant areas. A couple of other geographically significant areas in Region 9 are Lake Tahoe and the San Francisco Bay. Both of them are water bodies that have been degraded over time due to historical impacts, discharges, and population growth. But EPA funding has come in over time and has improved water quality and wetlands health very significantly. But this funding is also under threat, and without continued funding and the leverage that it provides to work with local and regional partners, these improvements will at best stall and at worst be lost. In California and Arizona, we share an international border with Mexico, and there's been rapid unplanned growth on the Mexico side of the border, especially since NAFTA became effective. The rivers run north, and air pollution, especially at the U.S. ports of entry, affects both sides of the border, obviously. So these conditions lead to more air pollution and water pollution, including raw sewage, industrial waste, and trash flowing into the U.S., not infrequently closing beaches in California because of contamination. So without continued funding, which helps to bring our Mexico counterparts to the table, these problems are likely to continue or worsen. I mentioned that Region 9 has 148 Native American tribes within its borders, and the tribes rely on EPA funding to address very basic public health and environmental needs: safe drinking water, wastewater sanitation, waste management. There are over 1,000 open dumps on tribal lands in Region 9, and EPA is a partner in helping the tribes manage these pretty basic needs. So reduced funding takes away resources that the tribes really need and technical assistance that EPA staff can provide. Another example is that the administration has proposed eliminating the lead program, which works to eliminate childhood lead poisoning resulting from lead-based paint, which is a major contributor to high blood lead levels. The training and compliance inspections provided by the regional office would be eliminated under that proposal. I want to quickly mention the Toxics Release Inventory program, which is very small, but it lets the public know what hazardous substances have been released from facilities within their communities. So it's important to them and allows them to understand what's happening around them. And that program is also vulnerable. George mentioned the Environmental Justice Program, and the regions have now what is a very small Environmental Justice Program, which has been slated for elimination. And as you know, low-income communities and communities of color are often most vulnerable to pollution. So people in these communities often seek EPA's help to address problems in their areas. And the program also helps EPA's own staff to consider the best ways to involve people in decisions that affect them. So without funding and without the resources, very modest resources in this program, the most vulnerable communities will continue to be disproportionately impacted. And then maybe I'll end just because of time with grants, but George mentioned that there's a huge amount of EPA funding that flows through EPA to our regulatory counterparts in the states, the tribes, the territories. So in the regional office, over 50% of our budget goes to our regulatory partners. And it's a primary way that EPA partners with those environmental agencies on most of our programs. So although EPA carries out environmental work directly, many of our statutes are designed to give states, territories, and tribes the lead, backed up by EPA funding and technical and program support. So this funding is at risk, but even if the money to remain stable, but at the same time EPA's staff is cut, the huge workload involved in issuing the grants, in overseeing work plan priorities, and ensuring good fiduciary management of the grant funding could not effectively occur. If you don't have enough staff to do this work, there's no assurance of accountability that the funding will be used for the highest environmental priorities. In many states, the environmental agencies don't really have the support of their political leadership. And many agencies have been facing the same kind of severe belt tightening, possibly even worse, than EPA over the last many years. So being able to work effectively with our partners through these grants is really of primary importance for being able to carry out the program as well. So those are just some of the examples of things that go on in a regional office. And I think I'll just end there for now and pass it over to Gay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gay McGregor, and I have worked at EPA for 35 years. I retired in December. I spent most of my career in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at our National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory, which is part of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality. So while most of our employees are in Ann Arbor and we have a fully functioning lab, we do have some employees in Washington, and we're part of the Office of Air. Our mission is to protect human health and the environment by reducing air pollution from mobile sources, or everything that moves and pollutes, and the fuels that power them. Mobile sources, transportation sources, account for about 50% of all harmful smog-forming emissions, particulates, and ozone, and 27% of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. We implement several laws, Clean Air Act, of course, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, and the Energy Independence and Security Act. What we do specifically is set standards for literally every kind of mobile source, from cars, SUVs, minivans, pickups, trucks, buses, motorcycles, all kinds of off-road equipment, trains, airplanes, and large ocean-going vessels, and the fuels. Each year, in order for a manufacturer to sell their cars in the U.S., they have to receive a certificate from us, from EPA, allowing that vehicle to be sold in the U.S. because it meets emission standards. We certify 4,500 different types of vehicles and engines every year. The manufacturers actually reimburse the Treasury, not EPA, for our services to provide those certificates. At about $20 million a year goes to the Treasury from that action. We also have a multifaceted compliance program that makes sure that the vehicles in use meet standards. And you might all be familiar with Dieselgate and the VW emission scandal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later because that's one of our most important functions is compliance and enforcement. And we work with our Office of Enforcement to do settlements with violators. We also, probably most familiar to most people, as we generate the data that goes onto the fuel economy labels that are on all new cars. It's used by the Department of Transportation. We do that program in concert with them, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Program. And fuel economy actually translates into greenhouse gas reductions, which is an important thing for us. We recently put out standards for greenhouse gases from vehicles, from light-duty vehicles, which are everything from cars to SUVs. We also provide critical technical data to the regions and to the states for state air quality plans. And we have a series of voluntary programs that operate to address in-use emissions from diesel engines. Our authorities are only for setting standards for new engines. So there's a whole range of engines that are out there that are older, that have weaker standards, and can have actions taken like retrofit that will reduce their emissions. Basically, cars now are about 99% cleaner than they were in 1970. And some of the standards that we have set have really sparked the development of a lot of technology and made our auto manufacturers some of the leaders in the world in terms of emission control. For example, catalytic converters, onboard computers, some of the onboard diagnostics that you have on your car are all developed in concert with us. Basically, we've also done, as I mentioned, a series of things in recent years to address greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a series of standards that were published in 2012 that are gradually more stringent from now until 2025. And we did a review of those standards to make sure that the 2025 standards were achievable. We produced 10,000 pages of documentation and took 8 years to do the analysis and showed that even an F-150 pickup could meet the advanced standards that will go into effect between 2022 and 2025. The Trump administration has chosen to reopen that review, and one of the things that I have developed for all of you is a way that you can comment on supporting the existing standards staying in place. I want to talk for a minute about the lab itself. We have all types of test facilities, from cold facilities where we can test vehicles at cold temperatures to advanced heavy-duty facilities where we can test very large engines. And it takes people to run the lab. And some of the cuts that are being proposed by this administration would basically mean, between the cuts in staff and the 30% cut that's been proposed, even at the 7% level, we won't have enough staff to really do the science behind the standards or even issue the certificates that manufacturers need to put their vehicles into the market for sale. So our work depends on both the lab and our people, and we're very worried about the type of cuts that are coming down the pike because test vehicles and engines, we have to ensure compliance. And if you know about the Dieselgate, you realize that manufacturers don't always operate in good faith. We found about 480,000 diesel engines that were being produced by VW that did not comply with clean air standards and, in fact, in some cases violated those standards by as much as 40%. The diesel, it took us a while, and actually our lab, the role that we played in it, we were involved with the state of California, the California Air Resources Board, to get a settlement from VW. But our particular role was our scientific expertise The engineers in the lab were actually able to figure out how the VW was programming their cars so that they would turn off the emission controls when certain conditions were met. And ironically, one of the conditions was it detected how much the steering wheel was vibrating. And if the steering wheel wasn't vibrating very much, it meant that the car was on an emissions test dynamometer, because on the road it vibrates more. So when they detected a vibration at a certain level, they would turn off the emission controls and the car would emit a much higher rate of emissions of NOx, actually NOx, oxides of nitrogen. And because of that, we were able to negotiate a settlement with VW that basically provides billions of dollars, $2.7 billion, to a mitigation trust fund for the affected vehicles. And that trust provides for the allocation of specific state and territorial and tribal government beneficiaries to use specific NOx reduction actions, and to then invest an additional $2 billion to promote and advance use of zero emissions vehicles and infrastructure. And this basically has also a $225 million trust fund to mitigate the pollution that has already occurred from the violating vehicles that are already out there in the market. So basically, I think the cuts to our budget will prevent us from doing a lot of this work. The staff that we have at EPA is under threat of being cut by almost a third. And it takes a lot of money to operate the lab. Our budget is about $108 million a year for all of our laboratory and operations. So I think those are some tangible examples of what we lose if we get this kind of cut. And a 30% cut would basically shut us down in terms of the laboratory. We just couldn't operate it. So I think tomorrow, or I guess somehow you guys will get a fact sheet that I put together, and the front of it summarizes some of what I've said, and the back has a way that you can comment with an example comment to support the greenhouse gas rules. And I guess I'll stop and we can take questions.
Thanks, Kay. And thank you to Francis and George as well. We'll be hearing from them again in a few minutes for Q&A. Something I find myself saying a lot lately is that the EPA is really a people's agency. It's been under attack before, but never quite like this, and really needs our help right now. With that in mind, I think I'm going to send things back over to Liz.
Thanks a lot, Lucas. And thank you so much, George, Francis, and Gay, for joining us today. As everyone on the phone can see, right now it's so critical that we do everything we can to protect the EPA, because we want to protect our environmental protections from further budget cuts and actually push members of Congress to fund the agency back at the level it needs to be funded. We are going to take a few questions. The first thing that we're going to do is there was a set of questions that some of our lead volunteers brainstormed in advance of this call, and I'm going to ask Liz Kazel to share two questions. Liz?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Kazel. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the first question that we had brainstormed was just kind of more broadly about y'all's work day to day at the agency and the kind of daily functions of the agency. So what were those? What did that kind of day to day of y'all's job look like? And then our second question is kind of about you all personally. Like what drove you to go and join the EPA?
Great. So any one of the three of you can jump in and answer one or two Liz's questions. And after you answer Liz's questions, then we're going to go to picking some folks on the phone to ask some questions. Anyone feeling inspired?
Well, I'll go. Okay, Fran.
Go ahead, Gay.
No, it's okay. You go first. I'll say something after that.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll start with the second question, what drove me to join EPA. When I was growing up, there was a lot in the news about things like rivers being on fire and hazardous waste and materials flowing into people's basements, and other stories of contamination and harm, and smog, air pollution was a big issue. So I was really motivated about that. I got a degree in environmental science and ended up at EPA, which, I didn't necessarily have the goal of working for EPA, but I'm very glad that it was EPA that I ended up at, because what really matters to me is supporting the public, not necessarily, for example, working for a contractor and worrying about profits at the same time. In terms of day-to-day work, it's really different depending on the position. So, take anything I say with a grain of salt, because it's really different. For example, at one point in my work at EPA, I coordinated with one of our large states on a hazardous waste grant that covered several aspects of Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And so I did a lot of work day to day to communicate with that state's representative to make sure that we were, depending on where we were in the cycle, that we were negotiating the grant work plan components of the following year, that reporting was occurring to tell us what had been accomplished or what challenges had been run into, to review financial reporting to make sure that the grant funds were being used appropriately, and also to be able to provide assistance. Not necessarily, it might be assistance that I myself could provide, or it might be assistance that someone in one of our programs could provide. So that's one kind of work. I did also at other times in my work at EPA, I did compliance inspections. I was involved in a couple of criminal investigations. And so that involves going out into the field, kind of sometimes being fairly creative on the spot in terms of making sure that you're looking at and asking questions about what needs to be looked at and have questions asked, and then coming back and writing reports that are sufficient to support an enforcement action if an enforcement action is the appropriate thing to do. Some people are in compliance, but there are some bad actors, and so you want to be able to follow through. And later, I was in a position where I was supervising that activity, and so I was reviewing reports to make sure that they would support enforcement action if that was appropriate, and that we had all of our information and ducks in a row. So those are just a couple of examples. I'll see if someone, maybe Gay, you want to talk about.
Sure. So, like you, Fran, I was inspired by, in my case, the brown cloud in Denver, where I went to college. But I worked for the state of New Mexico for a long time, and I really got into the environmental issues there, and then got a master's degree in public policy, and eventually got hired by the EPA. But although when I got out of graduate school, it was the era of Ann Gorsuch, and the EPA wasn't hiring, but it took me about a year, and I got in. And I worked in administration when Ruckelshaus House was back after Gorsuch, and my job in part was to try to reinvigorate the agency from a time that had been pretty dark. I moved to Ann Arbor in 1985, and I did everything you can imagine there. And some of my day-to-day work was, for the last many years, I've run our Federal Advisory Committee, which is a group of outside parties that are balanced in interests between enviros and states and industry, to get advice from them about some of our work. I also was in charge of a division for a while that did state and local programs like inspection and maintenance programs, and the Smartway Transportation Partnership. And one of my jobs was to try to, quote, be creative about problems that we didn't have a clear way to solve. And one of those issues that I think I mentioned was the fact that diesel engines stay out there a really long time and they're quite dirty. And the newer diesel engines are a lot cleaner. And how do we deal with that problem? And the way we dealt with it was we came up with a program called Clean School Bus USA, which led to diesel emission reduction grants, which led to regional collaboratives, and created a structure to try to deal with the fact that we didn't really have the authority to mandate that there was, that in-use diesel engines met any kind of standard. So how did we clean them up, the ones that were already out there? So I did a lot of creative thinking about, almost on a day-to-day basis, about various problems that we had in dealing with mobile sources where we didn't have clear authority under the law. And then I did a lot of personnel work and hiring and things like that. So it really does vary depending on what your job is at the time. I mean, I wrote regulations. So it really depends on what your job is at the time. But the work at the agency is very varied and multifaceted, and you kind of have to be willing to do almost anything. And I think everybody that I know that works at EPA is willing to do almost anything, including copy and do our own typing and editing.
Thanks, Kay. Fran, just a note before I take more questions. I grew up on that burning river because I grew up in Cleveland.
Cuyahoga River.
On the west. I grew up on the west side of Cleveland in Lakewood, Ohio. So spent my entire childhood hearing about when the river burned, and it probably, growing up there and on Lake Erie, definitely influenced my decision to become a lifelong environmental and organizer and campaigner. So I understand the impact of those particular challenges that were happening at the time. We are going to take another round of questions. This time we're going to take them from the folks on the phone. So if you have a question, press 1 on your keypad. We're not going to be able to get through everybody, but I'm going to take a round of 3 questions. So press 1 on your phone. Give me a second. So the first person we're going to take is Sue.
Hi, this is Sue in St. Louis, and this is a hard question, but I think it might be fairly fundamental, and that is, if the EPA administrator doesn't want a larger budget, how can we really convince Congress to give him more than he would ask for?
Great. Thank you, Sue. Now I'm going to take 2 more before you answer that. I'm going to take Rabbi Joel.
Right. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, and basically my question is, aside from signing petitions which offer up our emails parenthetically, I don't see much of a way forward for those of us in the general public. I have congressmen who are split, and I know which way they're going to vote before I even call them. I actually live most of the time in Colorado. I've got a Democrat and a Republican, and they can't be any further from each other. And I'm frustrated because what you're presenting is a direct threat to my health and the health of my children and grandchildren. I want to know what beyond just signing internet petitions can we do?
Thank you. And then finally, Candace.
To go through as this administration seems to want that to happen. How long do you think it will take before people see that the deleterious impacts of that are actually affecting them, that may then help galvanize people to be able to respond more forcefully, both to their congressional representatives and to the administration, to say, no, you've gone too far, and in connection with the other 2, get more money back in here, get the enforcement in here. The what can we do part, that if push has to come to shove. Do you have any estimate of what you think it might take for that to happen if the worst case scenario goes through right now?
So I'm going to take the three questions, and just one note on the Rabbi Joel's question is right after the question and answer, we're going to talk a little bit about some additional things that people can do besides signing petitions. The three of you don't necessarily have to tackle that because that's exactly what we go into in our next steps and the action that's coming up. But any of you that want to jump in on any of those three questions?
Okay, well, this is George, and maybe I'll take the first one because I've been working on the budget issues here in D.C. So the first question was, well, what if the administration doesn't ask for more money? How can Congress provide more than that? I think that was the general gist of the question. And that is in effect what's happened so far. The Trump administration budget proposed just immense cuts of 30+%, even more to the states. The House Appropriations Committee, and I got to say, the House Appropriations Committee cannot be a hotbed of liberalism, but the House Appropriations Committee passed a bill that, while still, as I said earlier, is a grave concern, 7% to 15% cuts. It's smaller cuts than the administration asked for. So Congress is not dependent on what the administration wants, and even Republicans in Congress are not dependent on what the administration wants. There is certainly a question that if they appropriate money and then the Pruitt administration doesn't want to use it, there are some games that they can play. But legally, they are required. This came up in the Nixon administration, and a law was passed that requires them to basically to spend the budget that Congress has made the decision, and by signing the bill, the President has made the decision that this is the level of resources that an agency ought to have. So they're legally required to spend it, and they can actually be sued if they don't. So it is possible for Congress to provide more than has been asked for, and they're required to spend it. I will just touch on the other question about what we can do. That is certainly more in your bailiwick, Liz and Lucas, but I will say just from this end, my observation is that even Republicans who look pretty deep red, there's often some particular local concern, and they care about the local concerns. At the hearing in the House,